Social activism in Minneapolis started long before the country saw it in Operation Metro Surge. Who better to understand the history of Minnesota politics than a reporter who's been writing about it for 50 years? Award-winning journalist Lori Sturdevant has the reporting credentials and perspective we need on this episode of Life Unscripted. Welcome to the podcast.
Great to be with you, Alix.
Great to have you here. All right, so you have had a remarkable career, 50 years of being a journalist, a writer. You know, you retired in 2018. If you can just give us a little bit of an overview of your work as a journalist.
Well, my whole career was at the Star Tribune, which makes me a professional dinosaur, not moving from one place to the next anymore. I was hired as a summer replacement reporter in 1975, came back for good in, I think it was February of 76, and just stayed there until I retired in 2018 with some health issues, I must confess. But I got better, and I still do about one column a month for the Star Tribune. I've also done a lot of books.
Yeah, you have many, many books, and we are going to talk about those books. There really is nobody better for political context, I believe, to be sitting here and talking about history and politics. And, you know, a big part of this podcast has been focusing on Operation Metro Surge and its impacts on Minneapolis. And I'm wondering if you think that maybe the kind of the tradition of civil engagement kind of maybe helped mobilize what we've seen, this grassroots response to ICE in Minneapolis and all across the state. And how do you think that history has impacted what's happened here?
Oh, I absolutely agree that history was crucial to what happened, to the response that we saw in January and February in Minneapolis and St. Paul to Operation Metro Surge. You know, probably more than many other places in the country, this has been traditionally and still is a civically engaged, civically involved population by a variety of measures that I've seen through the years about participation in unions or in churches. We lead the nation almost every election in voter turnout. People do engage with each other a lot. Maybe it has to do with our weather or our Scandinavian/New England roots, but for whatever reason, those connections were there to be called upon in a time of distress. And January and February this year were a time of distress for lots of our neighbors.
Up until the ICE surge, do you think that things were fading in that regard? Were people a little less civically engaged and maybe it got reignited after the ICE surge or maybe after Trump was reelected?
Oh, possibly so, in that there has been a national drift away from that kind of connection. On the other hand, our voter turnout is as high as it's ever been. And I look for that to be the same again this year in our 2026 midterm. I think we've led the nation in the presidential years. I think something like 10 of the last 12 presidential elections. Voter turnout in 2024 and again in 2022 and 2020, high as could be in Minnesota. And I shouldn't say high as could be. There's always a few more people we could get to the polls.
Sure.
But if that's a significant measure, and I think it is a significant measure, I once wrote a book called Turnout.
Yes.
That is an indicator that Minnesotans haven't given up on each other and they haven't given up on democracy.
And they're inspiring really the rest of the country, too.
I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so, too. So based on your experience and expertise, let's talk about the battle like within the DFL party, for instance. Progressives like Peggy Flanagan and moderates, a little bit more moderate Angie Craig on the DFL side. Would you say that there are historical precedents maybe for this type of sort of intra-party conflict that's going on right now?
Oh, sure. This place was a headquarters of intra-party conflict, and all you have to think about is 1968 when Gene McCarthy and Hubert Humphrey were the leading candidates for president until Bobby Kennedy entered and then sadly was assassinated. But here we had in Minnesota two native sons, one of them representing the staunchest of the anti-war movement, one of them a defender up until the last part of his campaign of Lyndon Johnson's Vietnam War policy, right here in Minnesota. And then you can go through the years at other times when Minnesota DFLers would splinter along the ideological lines that people in my line of work like to focus on. But there's also something more, and it refers to what we were just talking about, the grassroots nature of Minnesotans and their connections. I do think there's an ideological element to this U.S. Senate primary that we're focusing on right this minute with Peggy Flanagan and Angie Craig. But there's also the fact that Peggy Flanagan has been lieutenant governor for 8 years and has traveled the state consistently during that period and has made lots of friends and lots of personal connections. Angie Craig's focus has been on her 2nd congressional district and on Washington. She's just simply not as well known. And I think that matters.
Yeah. Peggy Flanagan's stance has been she's not taking any big PAC money, any money from big corporations. And that seems to be how she's separating herself from Angie Craig. But Angie Craig has a much bigger war chest. Do you think like that, just having that kind of money issue, money in politics, has changed much over the years?
Oh, I think it has changed in that the amount of money that is being spent by outside groups has swelled and swelled and swelled. This whole super PAC phenomenon really is a post-Citizens United phenomenon. In other words, it's only about 15 years old. And it has really taken charge of our political system. I suspect that when Peggy Flanagan, about 18 months ago now, announced that she'd be a candidate for the U.S. Senate and said that she would not take herself in her own campaign money from certain kinds of corporations and other donors. I suspect she thought this was an important but not necessarily headline-leading decision on her part. It has become the headline, and I think that has surprised and maybe even troubled some DFL primary voters who would wish we could talk about something other than how we pay for politics. But I think, Alix, how we pay for politics right now is at the root of a lot of our problems. And I think it's time to start talking about how we change and improve the way we pay for politics. Maybe this campaign could help spur that conversation.
Well, speaking of conversation, we're going to continue ours. We're going to move on to Republicans here in Minnesota, but we're going to take a quick break on Life Unscripted, and we'll be right back. Do you ever have an energy drink and you realize, oh, that's a little bit too much caffeine? Well, here's an idea for you. Aspire. Aspire energy drinks are so yummy. In fact, this one is mango lemonade, and it's delicious. Half the caffeine, and it also has green tea, a lot of great flavors, and I've arranged a great listener discount for you, 20% off if you use the promo code AKLIFE. So 20% off of these Aspire drinks at aspiredrinks.com. You will love feeling inspired with Aspire. I have a brand new skincare product that I want to talk to you about, and it's from Lavindus, and it even has pretty little packaging. I just got back from Arizona where the sun and the heat and the dry air really did a number on my skin, and I always think that serum is the best way to go when it comes to nourishing your skin. And this one is from, you can see, Lavindus Amrutini. Isn't it a pretty little bottle? And it's Luminosity Dewdrop Serum, and it is, what's really wonderful about this is it smells really light and fresh. It's not, as heavy perfumes. You just put a little bit of this on, just kind of dab it on after you, of course, cleanse. And it just makes your skin feel nice and dewy. And we want that, right? It's springtime. And by the way, you can get 21% off if you use the code AKLIFE. Yes, 21% off, Lavindus.com. You'll see the deal. Go to my show notes and get your skin ready for spring. Okay, before we get back into Republicans here in the state of Minnesota, we'll talk about U.S. Senator Amy Klouchar and her decision to step away from the Senate to then run now as the governor of Minnesota. Why do you think she decided to do that now?
Amy Klouchar is an ambitious person who wants to make a difference. She's not just wanting a name and a title. She wants to be able to do something significant to better her state. I think that's been her goal since before she entered politics. And I should disclose that back at the Star Tribune for a time, I was her dad's column editor. So I've known Amy and her dad and her family for a long time. So I've been able to watch her career. There are people on social media who are constantly speculating that Amy Klouchar is running for governor because she wants it to be a springboard to another campaign for the presidency. I don't think so. I think that misreads her situation. She's a woman in her mid-60s. I think she sees that she has 8, maybe 10 more years of public service in her, provided her health holds. And she wants those to be an opportunity to make a difference for her state. And right now, in many ways, it appears to me that governors can have a great deal of influence, more so than U.S. senators. We can talk, and I'd be pleased to talk about what has happened to our legislative branch of government in Washington. It's not a good story, and I think Amy's decision reflects the frustration that many of the people who labor in that branch of government now have with their ability to be effective.
You can imagine her frustration and maybe getting to that point where she's like, okay, I don't see how I can help things, for the state and for the country. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to do what I can here in Minnesota. And I know I was surprised, I think as a lot of other people, but perhaps that was just she wants to make her last years meaningful, her last time serving in office.
Those of us with the old tapes in our heads, and I'm one of them, tend to think sometimes that U.S. Senator is a more prestigious office than governor. That may not be true anymore.
Yeah. Now, you have written many books, co-authored books, edited books. You've co-authored with former Senator Dave Durenberger. This was a wonderful book called When Republicans Were Progressive. Mm-hmm. And if you can just maybe describe how maybe he, along with more moderate Republicans like Bill Frenzel, were really important to the state of Minnesota.
I used to think that kind of centrist Republican was sort of the set point in Minnesota politics, that if you had a generic centrist Republican and a generic DFLer on the ballot, the centrist Republican would have the energy. That was sort of where Minnesota was for a lot of years, and then things changed. And the story of that, when that party was in its heyday, beginning with Harold Stassen through the end of the Arnie Carlson administration in the 90s, that's the story that Dave Durenberger's book, my book, tells, with a focus, of course, on Dave's career, because that was part of the mission of that book as well. But that was where Minnesota politics was. And in many respects, the DFL party, which was what Hubert Humphrey created at about the same time that Harold Stassen was in his heyday, it was a center-left party, mm-hmm. and Humphrey made sure it stayed in the center by pushing the more socialist element of the Farmer Labor Party out of power. So between Harold Stassen in the Republican Party and Hubert Humphrey in the DFL, we had created two center-left parties that did a pretty good job of governing the state.
How do you think Durenberger and Frenzel would maybe view current candidates right now, for instance, Kendall Walz, or I know just today President Trump said he's endorsing Mike Lindell.
Well, we know that Dave Durenberger was a never-Trump Republican, so much so that in 2016 he had a Hillary Clinton lawn sign in his yard in St. Paul. So that's how far he went to get away from that. Bill Frenzel's been gone for a longer stretch. I didn't ever have a chance to ask Bill Frenzel what he thought of Donald Trump, but I suspect he and Dave Durenberger would be thinking alike in those ways. What I wrote about recently in the Star Tribune, and what I think would be the case with some of those more senior Republicans, is that they would question the party's decision to go with people, endorse candidates who have no government experience, never served in elective office, never personally experienced what it is to have the accountability to the voters that goes with that assignment of trust. We have in both the U.S. Senate candidate and the gubernatorial candidate, and I believe the Lieutenant Governor candidate as well, endorsed in the Republican Party this year, no elective office experience. I can't remember when that has happened before, and it's a trust in outsiders that I think we've seen in both parties is sometimes misplaced.
Right. Let's move on to a woman who truly was so inspiring. Her name is Joan Grow, and you have a fascinating memoir. It's called Turnout, Making Minnesota the State That Votes. Talk a little bit about her. She was one of the female pioneers in the DFL.
That's for sure. She was part of that, what we call now the second wave movement of feminism, the first wave being suffrage, that period in the long run up till the 1920 19th Amendment is finally adopted. And then a period of kind of feminism going fallow arrives that lasted about 50 years almost, where not too many women ran for elective office. Their roles were rather secondary or subservient within political circles. And then starting with the late 60s, we begin to see a quickening. And in the case of Joan Grow, who was a kid born in Minneapolis and raised in St. Louis Park and in Buffalo, Minnesota, where her dad was the hardware store owner and the mayor, She had that grassroots political orientation that comes from those experiences, but she got involved in the League of Women Voters and in the anti-war movement, and gets recruited kind of by accident to run for the legislature in 1972, which is remembered in feminist circles in Minnesota as kind of a breakthrough year. Now, you got to put all that breakthrough talk in context. We had in the 1971 Minnesota legislature one woman. Her name was Helen McMillan. She was from Austin, Minnesota, and she had been the state president of the League of Women Voters. Not a coincidence. The League kept kind of a feminist candle alive during all those fallow years. In 1972, something like a dozen women run for the legislature. 6 of them win, 2 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and Joan Grow is one of the DFLers. It's still a nonpartisan legislature. They don't have the party labels on the ballot, but 6 women win, and that's considered such a breakthrough that the headline in a few days later was that the women are taking over. 6 women out of 201 legislators. Women are taking over. 2 years later, Joan Grow sees an opportunity to run statewide. This is the post-Watergate election. Minnesota has just passed a sweeping voter registration bill. First time ever that there was a statewide requirement for voter registration in Minnesota. The sitting Republican Secretary of State, a good guy named Arlen Erdahl, didn't like that bill, didn't like the fact that it included Election Day registration, which we have to this day as a result of that bill. Joan had been a League of Women Voters activist. She loved the idea of improving our registration system, improving our votes, and she ran against Arlen Erdahl for Secretary of State. It being the post-Watergate election, Republican turnout was way down, and she wins the Secretary of State's job. She held it for the next 24 years.
Unbelievable. 24 years. And I remember that, the burgeoning women's lib, Gloria Steinem, there was just a lot more of that. And it felt so fresh and new back then.
Yeah.
And I think about how feminism has changed.
Yeah. Joan will tell about how she would go to counties around the state to train election judges. And people would come off the streets just to listen to her because they thought it was such an oddity to have a female Secretary of State.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. I think my mother told a story where she was at some political fundraiser and she was there. She had a very minor role, but when she showed up, basically was thought that she was the person that brought the cookies and the coffee, and she told them, no, she was not, and probably did a very different way. Minnesota has had a lot in the Twin Cities going on here, and I know that you have written extensively about Melissa Hortman and the assassination of her and her husband and that shooting, just some recent tragedies. Do you think that they have, permanently had an impact on the DFL? And tell me about her legacy and what you've said about her.
The thing that immediately made me worried after her assassination was that good people would no longer want to run for office. How could they look at their spouse or their kids and say, I'm going to put myself at this kind of risk? So I was afraid that candidate recruitment would really suffer this year. Thus far, though, the evidence is to the contrary. For the first time, I think, in state history, DFL candidates have filed in every legislative district. All 201 legislative districts, 67 senators, 134 House members, all have a DFL candidate on the ballot. There was an attempt to do that in 1972, the election we just talked about, and they came 3 districts short. So this is a big indication that there is still a willingness to serve, and hallelujah for that. And maybe one could even say that Melissa Hortman's example inspired that. What I'd like to focus on is not the way Melissa Hortman died, though that was a terrible tragedy and something we ought to make every effort to not ever see again. But I'd like to focus on the kind of leader that she was, really committed to the legislative branch of government and making that branch functional, making it work, even when the numbers were evenly divided, 67-67 in her final session. Even when her majority, she had the majority, but it was very slim, like it was in 2023. She got a great deal done that year. Even when we have a crisis, as she did all during those COVID years when she was Speaker and had to make adjustments in the way the legislature usually operated, and adjustments how it operated with the governor and the other branches of government, being that flexible, but keeping the legislature central, which is what our Constitution calls for, and which is what we are not seeing enough of, in my opinion, in Washington right now. So I'd like to focus on Melissa for that reason.
her friends and community really wanted to keep her spirit alive and showing what kind of a leader that she was and how spirited she was, and LFG. And, she had a different style of that. I think that is really missed, and just her leadership is so needed right now.
She was popular on both sides of the aisle, and there aren't too many leaders who can claim that. Fortunately, Minnesota has had a few. I have to tell you that in those terrible weeks after her passing, one of the other legislators who was in the crosshair of this assassin, but who was able to be spared, was State Senator Ann Rest, who's been in the legislature for 42 years and is retiring this year. Ann and I were visiting, and she said she keeps hearing Melissa Hortman referred to as the most consequential speaker in state history, and that's deserved. But Ann said, I think about it, that whenever I hear that, she said, I think, yes, except for Martin Sabo, who's the focus of the book that I wrote that came out last year. Martin Sabo was the Speaker of the Minnesota House in the 1970s, a time of great institutional reform. And when I talk about that book, I often point out that the institutional focus of Martin Sabo was also present in Melissa Hortman. This making the institution work well so that it can play the role that the Constitution intends for it is a big job right now, that it needs attention.
And we can't also mention this without mentioning State Senator John Hoffman and his wife Yvette. And we know just recently there were some attacks at their home, and it's just more violence. It does, I think, make a lot of people concerned that running seems like a dangerous thing now. So the kind of commitment level to give to public service it feels like it's dire. It's important.
Yes.
It's more critical now than ever.
What we see is Minnesotans not retreating in the face of these threats, but kind of getting their back up.
Yeah.
So wanting to resist, wanting to stand up and say, no, this is not what we want. I hope we don't lose that spirit.
And you mentioned Martin Sabo. So you've written this book, The Making of the Modern Legislature, and he really developed kind of the way that came together, the state government, and worked effectively, improving people's lives. Tell me a little bit more about him.
Well, he was a son of El Cabo, North Dakota. In his growing up years, that would be population 100. It's far less than that now. Up as far away from the Twin Cities as you can get and still be in North Dakota. The upper northwest corner of the North Dakota oblong there is where he hailed from. He was a son of Norwegian immigrants and a son of the Lutheran Free Church, which had as its headquarters institution Augsburg College, now Augsburg University, in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood of Minneapolis. So at age 17, that's where he went to college. He didn't consider any place else, and fell in there with some liberal-minded DFLers who in 1960 were looking for an energetic young candidate for the legislature to take on an encrusted incumbent who had been taking bribes, quite frankly. These DFL reformers wanted to replace this older fellow, and here came young, fresh, still sort of off the North Dakota farm, Martin Sabo, who wins that legislative seat. He served 18 years in the legislature and then 28 years, I want to say, in the U.S. House. But the focus of the book I wrote was on those legislative years because he, as Speaker, engineered some rather major institutional reforms and policy reforms that we celebrate to this day. You've probably heard about, and our listeners have probably heard about, the Minnesota Miracle.
Right.
That's the description of the 1971 legislation that got the state much more involved in the funding of schools and local governments. Martin Sabo was a principal architect of that, even though he was minority leader then, not speaker.
You are a wealth of information. It's unbelievable, the historical context you're adding to what's going on right now. We are going to just take a quick moment to break, have a little sip, but we'll be right back here on Life Unscripted. Hey, I want to tell you about a product that I absolutely love. They are my Cozy Earth pajamas. They are just soft and buttery, and I can't tell you, I would actually prefer to wear them all day long. Now, I've arranged a fantastic discount for my listeners of Life Unscripted. Enter promo code AKLIFE for 21% off any product you purchase at Cozy Earth. Once again, that's 21% off. Go to CozyEarth.com and use promo code AKLIFE, and let's get cozy. You know, one way to elevate your look is by a pair of great eyeglasses. And I have a lot of them. I have prescription eyeglasses. I have sunglasses. Why? Well, because, I need to see, and also to protect my eyes from the bright sunshine. And I have found some very stylish eyewear from Aquila. Here they have eco-friendly frames, so many different colors. You know, we've got classic black, and they are affordable. They're made in LA, but they're not just for movie stars. And I have a great deal for you. For all of my listeners, just use the promo code AKLIFE, and you will get 10% off. 10% off of any of the frames there at aquila.la. You can also find a deal on my show notes. Just click on that link, and you get 10% off of Aquila eyewear. I know that I do this, and a lot of my friends, we sit and think about, is it ever going to be the same again? Are we ever going to be civil to one another? Can we reset this country and this state? And you know, we're looking for some hope here. Yeah. What are your thoughts on the way things have changed?
Well, we're never going to go back. That's not the way life works. But if we understand our history and understand not only what worked, but why it worked in the past, that will help us. That will be a guide for us as we go forward. That's what I believe. That's been one of the reasons I've enjoyed writing these history books about that last third of the 20th century in Minnesota. That's the period in which Minnesota began to really pull apart from other Midwestern states in income, in educational attainment, in numbers of Fortune 500 companies, and a variety of quality of life measures. Minnesota began to stand out, and probably not entirely coincidentally, we began to lead the nation in voter turnout, and we've been voting in a distinctive way in presidential elections all that time. That period should be studied and understood because we want to sustain our success going forward. Things like building that well-educated workforce. How did we do that? How do we continue to do that when our workforce is now much more racially mixed, much more ethnically mixed than it used to be? Learning how to put our attention on that kind of thing. That's important. And I'm hoping that's what a focus on that successful period will help us do.
What do you see a post-Trump era to look like when he is no longer in office? And here in Minnesota, I mean, obviously that's your focus, but you've certainly have looked at things from a much broader perspective.
Well, I remember the post-Watergate, post-Nixon era. That's how old I am. And so I remember that after a president resigns with very low poll numbers and in some disgrace, that's what happened there. I'm not predicting that Trump will resign, not even necessarily predicting what his poll numbers will be when his presidency ends, but it looks to me right now that he will go with a lot of people wanting to make some changes, some reforms. After Nixon, there was a surge of interest in reform around things like campaign finance, about some other kinds of ways that we do things. I'd like to see a reformist zeal come to the fore in a post-Trump era. And I have a pet idea I'd like to pitch, if I may.
Please do.
We could have redistricting in Minnesota as early as 2027 if we have a DFL trifecta, Governor, House, Senate, and we have a willingness on the part of those DFLers to do a midterm redistricting, as we have seen in some other states. And let me tell you, I hope we don't do that. I think it's a bad practice to do these midterm redistricting. Redistricting should be occasioned by a new census and not by political pressure from Washington, in my opinion. Nevertheless, the next census will be in 2030. That's not so long from now. The next opportunity to redistrict will be in 2031. That's 5 years hence from where we now are. It's a chance for us to begin to think about how will we do that so that we solve some problems along the way. My pet idea, let's enlarge the Minnesota House. And while we're at it, I would be game to enlarge the U.S. House, too. I think part of driving more energy, attention, power into the hands of the legislative branch would be that would be enhanced if at the same time we were enlarging this body, securing more grassroots campaigning. I like to point out that the 134-member House, it was actually 135 in 1919 when we made the Minnesota House 135 members. The Supreme Court eventually said you have to have equal protection under the law, and they took it down to 134. That means that we had the potential, and it's happened twice in on my watch here, in both 1979 and now in 2025, 26, where we've had a tied Minnesota House. I would like us to enlarge the House in such a way that that doesn't happen again. And my idea is We now have 2 House districts contained geographically within every Senate district. I'd like to make it 3. Now, you can do that by somewhat shrinking the Minnesota Senate, and that would be a political fight that we might not want to have. Or we can simply say it's time to buy new furniture in the Minnesota House chamber, and we're going to have a 201-member Minnesota House. That sounds really big, but when you think about it, in 1919, when we went to 135 House members, the state's population was 2.5 million. It's almost 6 million now. We originally thought that House districts should have, about 30,000, 35,000 members. Now our House districts are getting much bigger than that. It's making individual grassroots campaigning less likely to happen, less possible. And let me tell you, one of the lessons I've learned from the Martin Sabo research I've done is that representation is enhanced when an elected official periodically looks a voter in the eye, personally asks for the vote, personally finds out what's on that person's mind, looks around at that person's circumstances in their home. That's what representation entails. It says to that voter, I'm your servant. I seek your support. I'm accountable to you, and I'm available to you, accessible to you, should you need my services. That connection between the voter and the representative should be at the essence of our legislative branch of government, and we need to renew that. I think enlarging the House would help that happen. So that's, like I say, that's my favorite idea, though I've got a bunch of other ones. And I wish Minnesotans would bring forth at this time those ideas, because a good, robust debate will be needed on any such change before we make it happen.
I have a feeling these are some topics that we'll be seeing from you as you continue on writing columns, like you said, once a month, or you probably have like 100 ideas that you're going to put out there.
Well, I thank you for that encouragement, but I'm the elder statesperson here, or the elder journalist person here, and I'm hoping that I can encourage some of the younger folks who are still working full-time to get involved in this exercise as well.
Well, Lori Sturdevant, it is a pleasure having you here. You have just a wealth of information, and you've given some great context in just what Minnesota looks like, was before, how we can kind of piece together, connect the dots. It's just great to have you here. So thanks so much for coming on Life Unscripted.
Thank you, Alix. It's been fun.
Hey, thanks for listening to Life Unscripted. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and write me a review. Let me know what you think of the podcast. And when you buy any of the products and use my promo code AKLIFE, I get paid. And you help support the podcast.